So I actually have two texts to share with you this morning to introduce the presentation from Janice. The first comes from the fifth book of the Torah, known to us as Deuteronomy, chapters 10, 12 through 19. Some of this will probably sound very familiar to you. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Although heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth with all that is in it, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone and chose you, their descendants after them, out of all the peoples as it is today. Circumcise then the foreskin of your heart, and do not be stubborn any longer, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the second text comes from the Holy Scripture known as the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, meeting in Des Moines, Iowa this last summer. You didn't know that was scriptural status probably, but this was an emergency resolution introduced to our assembly this past summer that was approved overwhelmingly. And I'll just read it in part. Whereas we are called by our sacred scriptures to love our neighbor, accompany the vulnerable, and welcome the sojourner. Whereas the number of refugees worldwide has hit an unprecedented high of 70 million people in January of 2019, whereas while the number of refugees allowed into the United States currently is an unprecedented low of 30,000, down from the annual average of 95,000, whereas the Christian Church Disciples of Christ has engaged in refugee resettlement for over 75 years, resettling tens of thousands of refugees, whereas as July 2nd, 2019, 8,800 refugees have been approved for travel to the U.S., an additional 29,000 have passed required Department of Homeland Security interviews and may face danger if they are not allowed to enter the U.S. for resettlement. Therefore, be it resolved that the General Assembly of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, calls on members of the Christian Church to urge their congregations to engage in refugee settlement. Be it further resolved that the 29th General Assembly calls upon members and congregations of the Christian Church to share their faith values of hospitality for refugees in both private and public statements. Be it further resolved that organizations such as the Refugee and Immigration Ministries of Disciples Home Missions, Week of Compassion, and other ministries provide communication and information to congregations to encourage their support for heightened U.S. refugee resettlement. And lastly, be it further resolved that the General Minister and President of the Christian Church make a formal public statement denouncing cuts to the U.S. refugee admission program and work with ecumenical partners to support a return to at least the historic U.S. average of 95,000 refugees resettled annually. So it was in light of that when I met Janice just a few weeks ago and heard about her work, just recently returning from the Mexican side of the border and visiting the refugee camps that have emerged there since change in U.S. policy that has not allowed Central American refugees into the country. I said to myself, we need to hear this story that she has to educate ourselves, to better know what is happening as a result of the policies of our government. So Janice, I welcome you very much. I'm just delighted to have you here this morning.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dan, Reverend April. Thank you to the congregation for inviting me to speak here today. And a very special thank you to the choir for that beautiful song that really touched my heart. It speaks very much to what I have to share with you today. I'm here to talk about a refugee crisis that we have on our southern border. Can you hear me okay? Is that better? I'm here to speak about a refugee crisis on our southern border. And I'm able to be here to speak to you today because A little more than 100 years ago, my great-grandparents, facing growing persecution, packed up their children, my grandparents, and what little they could carry on their backs, and they boarded a ship bound for America. They reached Ellis Island, where they were given the opportunity to begin their journey to become Americans, something of which my grandmother was very proud. And I imagine that many of you here today share a similar story. Unfortunately, the people on our southern border who are fleeing horrible violence and persecution in their own homes are not being given that opportunity. About a year ago, the current administration enacted a new policy called the Mexican Protection Protocol, an ironic name. It's known as MPP, or more commonly as the Remain in Mexico policy. And it says, in violation of U.S. and international law, that refugees do not have the right to request asylum on U.S. soil. Instead, they are given a number, sent back to Mexico, and told to wait there for their court hearing. People typically wait upwards of 8 months for the multiple court hearings, and less than 1% will be granted asylum. So I had heard about this, read about it on the news, and I decided to go to see for myself what was happening on the border. And while I was there, I volunteered with a number of humanitarian aid organizations, and I also collected people's stories. And I'm here to share those stories with you today. But first, what I'd like to do is take you on a tour of the refugee camp that is across the Rio Grande River here, seen in this slide as I'm walking across the bridge into Mexico. The refugee camp is literally a stone's throw away from Brownsville, Texas, and as soon as you cross the bridge, you see the tents where the refugees are living. There are currently about 2,500 refugees living here. Many of them have been there for 8 months since MPP was enforced at the Brownsville crossing. There's children everywhere and people living their lives as best they can in the refugee camp, cooking on makeshift stoves. There are even some pop-up restaurants in the camp where some of the refugees are selling food. On first glance, it almost looks bucolic. This is up on the banks of the levee above the Rio Grande River, and people are living together in relative harmony. Here you see people waiting to charge their phones. There's no electricity or running water in the camp, but there is a phone charging station, pop-up barber shop, and refugees even organizing themselves to clean up along the banks to keep the place safe for their children. It's actually the cleanest place I've ever been in Mexico, and it almost looks bucolic until you realize that these people are living here year-round. It's over 100 degrees in the summer. In the winter, the wind is wicked. It blows. When it rains, everything they own gets soaked in the tents, and they've been sleeping on the cold, hard ground with virtually no hope at all of being granted asylum. Some children playing. And the other reality is that they live in constant fear. I took this picture because I had just met the man on the right. I was standing at one of the pop-up clinics speaking to the doctor there when he came stumbling up, sobbing uncontrollably. And in between sobs, he managed to tell us that the gangs that had been trying to recruit him in Honduras had come looking for him at his home, and when they found that he wasn't there, they murdered his 21-year-old sister. This is a common story. The doctor told me that this man had been shot at many times and still had bullet fragments lodged in his body. I met Maritza, the woman in blue, one of my first days in the camp. And she told me that she left Honduras under a similar situation when her brother was murdered by gangs. She fled to Mexico, where she married and had 3 children. She and her husband had a small stand on the beach, and every week they paid a bribe, extortion, to the drug cartels that ran the area and demanded that all business owners pay them money. One week they couldn't make the payment, and so the cartel came to her home looking for them. She and her husband and the children happened to be out, but the woman who lived with them and helped her care for her children was home, and the cartel murdered her. She then fled to the United States, where she requested asylum, and she was living with her 3 children. She was rounded up by ICE. She was detained. She was beaten by the guards in detention, and she was deported back to Honduras without her children. Her children were put into a foster home somewhere in the United States. She's made her way back to the border since then and is trying desperately to find anybody who can help her reunite with her children. The family separation policy ended as an official policy after great public outcry, but it still exists today in various forms. This is Santos, and he's showing me a picture on his phone of his 2 young daughters. Santos and his wife and their children left Honduras, again fleeing gang violence, and made their way to the US border before MPP was put in place. At the border, they were inexplicably separated. The wife and the younger daughter managed to get into the United States, where they requested asylum. Santos and the younger daughter were sent back across the border to Mexico, where they were kidnapped and held for ransom for 4 harrowing days before they managed to escape. Santos is still at the border trying to reunite his family. I met this lovely young girl, Yeleni, when I was in the camp one day. You notice I've blurred people's faces, or I'm not showing you their faces, and that is for their protection, because if the gangs or cartels happen to see people that they're hunting for, they are in danger. Yeleni and I spent a really fun day together, reading books, playing tic-tac-toe, and drawing pictures. And we talked about her life in the camp. And she told me about a cartel hawk, or a young man who works for the cartels as a lookout. His name, they call him the King, and he walks regularly through the camps looking for young girls to traffic. Human trafficking is rampant, as is kidnapping, and kidnapping of children. Yeleni told me, when we see the King, we run and we hide in the tent and we don't come out. My friend's mom told us to do that whenever we see him, and never to talk to him. Yeleni is 11 years old, and this is her reality. As I was leaving her that day, she ran after me, and she handed me this portrait of herself that she had drawn, and she told me, "Don't ever forget me." And Yeleni is one of the reasons I'm here speaking to you today, because I promised her I wouldn't forget her. The last story I want to share is Armando's story. Parents living in the camp are faced with a terrible choice. They live in an incredibly dangerous situation. Their children are always at risk of being kidnapped and trafficked. There's random violence, and the conditions are brutal. One choice that they have is to send their children to cross the border alone into the arms of Customs and Border Patrol, where they'll be detained and maybe one day end up being reunited with family in the United States. Think about that for a minute. What would it take for you to send your child alone across the border into a country that doesn't want you, knowing you might never see them again? That's the choice parents face. And Armando, who's pictured here on his Facebook page, a post from 5 years ago with his children, recently sent his 10-year-old, his wife and the younger girl are in the United States, where they were granted asylum 5 years ago. And he was in the camp with his 10-year-old son, and he sent him across the border. And on his Facebook page, he wrote, "This is the harsh reality. I had no choice but to send my 10-year-old son after a judge denied us the request for asylum. After being tortured, kidnapped, assaulted in Mexico, twice by the Mexican army and police, I could no longer do it. At least my son is safe from this hell." The situation at our border is dire. And when I went to the border, I expected to encounter the effects of the worst of humanity, and I did. But what I didn't expect to find was the best of humanity as well. And to quote one of my personal heroes, Mr. Rogers, "When things get bad, you look for the helpers." And in the refugee camp, there are many helpers. And I want to share a little bit about what they're doing. And they are also listed on the handout that's included in your church bulletin. The first organization I want to talk about is Team Brownsville, pictured here with a church group that traveled from Austin wearing those great tie-dye shirts. And Team Brownsville was formed by a couple of people. They're educators. This is Sergio, this is Andrea, and they live in Brownsville, Texas. And they noticed about a year and a half ago, when they crossed the border, that there were mothers from Central America sitting on the sidewalk in the blazing sun, nursing babies with only the clothes on their backs, and families sleeping in the street. And they realized that this was that first wave of migrants coming up in the caravan fleeing persecution in Central America. So they went home, and Sergio's mom cooked up a big meal. They put it in carts, and they hauled it across the border and fed the people. Since they started doing that 18 months ago, the number has grown from 10 people to 2,500 people, and Team Brownsville has continued to serve meals twice a day, 7 days a week, to feed the asylum seekers. When I first got there, we were serving meals out in the street, and this is a group from a synagogue in Washington, D.C., who had came and they paid for the meals, and they prepared the meals and served them. My second week there, World Central Kitchen showed up, and they started preparing meals inside, and they brought tables and chairs and their knowledge of how to cook for large quantities of people. And for the first time in almost a year, people were able to sit at tables and chairs and eat their food in a dignified way. The other thing that Team Brownsville has dedicated themselves to doing is providing the asylum seekers with what they need in order to survive. Sleeping bags, tents, everything you saw in those first pictures, including the clothes people are wearing, has been provided by Americans who have donated these goods. And Team Brownsville distributes them in a free store. They have 4 free stores in the camp where asylum seekers can come and get whatever they need. Melba is another member of Team Brownsville. She's an educator as well, and she has a school that's taught on Sundays by volunteers from the United States. Her passion is literacy. She's seen here teaching or reading a book to a group of children, and I loved that reading this morning. That was very beautiful. And Melba has also started a library. She gives away books to kids, and kids can come check out books whenever they want. And she accepts donations of books from all over. There are actually 3 schools in the camp. The biggest one right now is called the Sidewalk School because it is literally taught on the sidewalk. And this school was started by a woman named Felicia, who's a Brownsville native and also an educator. And she saw the need, and even though she doesn't even speak Spanish, she started a school. She hires asylum seekers to teach at the school. She pays them out of her own pocket and provides the supplies for them as well. These asylum seekers are the ones that I'm showing you right now are from Cuba and Venezuela. They're people who work in in technology and marketing. They're professionals they were professionals in their home country, and they're now living in the refugee camp. I spent an afternoon going over long division with this young boy from Ecuador. And he was getting really frustrated because he couldn't remember how to do it. And he said to me, "I'm afraid I've forgotten everything I've ever known." He hadn't been in school for a year. Here's a picture of them teaching school on a particularly cold day. So the sidewalk is underneath that balcony, and they hung tarps. And there are the children huddled under the tarps. You can see the wind blowing. They're wearing donated clothing to keep them warm, but they're still in school. This is Ray. He's an asylum seeker from Cuba. He's also one of the teachers, and he's one of the very few people I met who won his asylum case. He was an English professor in Cuba, fluent in 3 languages, and he worked at the school and also at the clinic translating. Here he is playing with the children. After he was granted asylum, instead of being released into the United States, he was put into detention, ostensibly because ICE has the right to appeal the verdict. He was released after several days, but while he was in detention, he met other people who had won their asylum cases 8 months earlier and were still detained. Global Response Management has a portable clinic there, and they provide health care to the refugees. This is Gabi Zafalas, and she's an American citizen who started the Matamoros Resource Center. These porta potties here were brought in by Team Brownsville. They pay for the porta potty rental, but the center built these hand washing stations, and they also provide filtration systems for water. They pump it out of the river to use it for washing. Also housed at the center is an organization called Lawyers for Good Government, where attorneys work pro bono. The woman in the pink shirt is an attorney, and I captured a very rare happy moment where she actually won a case. These people were not in MPP, they were Mexican citizens, but they had seriously ill children, and they were allowed to cross. They were not granted asylum, but they were allowed to come here temporarily. The final group I want to talk about is a group called Witness at the Border. And Witness at the Border does just that. They go and they witness. They were instrumental in closing the notorious child prison at Tornillo, and they're continuing their work at the border. Here they are protesting in front of the tent courts. You can see behind them those white tents. Those are constructed, they cost $25 million. We paid for them, not Mexico. And in those tents, it's a sham court. The judge appears on a screen via teleconferencing. The asylum seekers are processed in batches, and as I said, less than 1% will be granted asylum. In the middle of the picture holding the Free Them sign is Josh Rubin, who started this organization. Here they are with Sister Norma Pimentel, who runs Catholic Charities in McAllen, Texas, and also members of the Democratic National Hispanic Caucus who came and visited the camps in January. One of the things that they started doing at Witness is witnessing the mass deportation of people from the Brownsville airport. Over 60,000 people have been deported since MPP was put in place. And here they are being led shackled onto planes. You can see mothers carrying babies, young children being put on planes and sent back to their country or to Guatemala. There's a new policy called the Asylum Cooperation Agreement, which says people can't apply for asylum in the United States if they've traveled through another country. So they get to Guatemala and are given 72 hours to request asylum in one of the most dangerous countries in the Western Hemisphere. ICE didn't like the fact that Witness was there at the border, and so they started bringing in trucks to block their view, loading planes in the middle of the night. But the witnesses are still there. They're there 7 days a week, and they captured this picture. I'm not sure if you can tell, but it's a picture of a young woman with her feet shackled and chains around her wrist. This is our America. You and I are paying for it with our tax dollars. It's being done in our names. So I ask you, please, I know this is really hard to hear, but don't look away. Find a way to bear witness to MPP and these people who are coming here to flee persecution. There's a list that I gave you in the church bulletin of different organizations, as well as it lists the work that your church is doing supporting refugees and other things that you can do to support them. Please don't look away. Thank you.